I'm Jeremy. Today's day 390 of reading, trading Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Let's get started. We're currently on page 240. Let's go lock in. Course aims. 1. Understanding the principles underlying defensive magic. 2. Learning to recognize situations in which defensive magic can be legally used. 3. Placing the use of defensive magic in a context for practical use. For a couple of minutes, the room was full of the sound of scratching quills on parchment. When everyone had copied down Professor Umbridge's 3 course aims, she said, "Has everyone got a copy of Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbur Slinkard?" There was a dull murmur of assent throughout the class. "I think we'll try that again," said Professor Umbridge. "When I ask you a question, I should like you to reply, 'Yes, Professor Umbridge,' or 'No, Professor Umbridge.' So, has everyone got a copy of Defensive Magical Theory by Wilbur Slinkard?" "Yes, Professor Umbridge," rang through the room. "Good," said Professor Umbridge. "I should like you to turn to page 5 and read chapter 1, Basics for Beginners. There will be no need to talk." Professor Umbridge left the blackboard and settled herself in the chair behind the teacher's desk, observing them all closely with those pouchy toad's eyes. Harry turned to page 5 of his copy of Defensive Magical Theory and started to read. It was desperately dull, quite as bad as listening to Professor Binns. He felt his concentration sliding away from him. He had soon to read the same line half a dozen times without taking in more than the first few words. Several silent minutes passed. Next to him, Ron was absent-mindedly turning his quill over and over in his fingers, staring at the same spot on the page. Harry looked right and received a surprise to shake him out of his torpor. Hermione had not even opened her copy of Defensive Magical Theory. She was staring fixedly at Professor Umbridge with her hand in the air. Harry could not remember Hermione ever neglecting to read when instructed to, or indeed resisting the temptation to open any book that came under her nose. He looked at her questioningly, but she merely shook her head slightly to indicate that she was not about to answer questions, and continued to stare at Professor Umbridge, who was looking just as resolutely in another direction. After several more minutes had passed, however, Harry was not the only one watching Hermione. The chapter they had been instructed to read was so tedious that more and more people were choosing to watch Hermione's mute attempt to catch Professor Umbridge's eye than to struggle on with Basics for Beginners. When more than half of the class was staring at Hermione rather than at their books, Professor Umbridge seemed to decide that she could ignore the situation no longer. "Did you want to ask something about the chapter, dear?" she asked Hermione, as though she had only just noticed her. "Not about the chapter, no," said Hermione. "Well, we're reading just now," said Professor Umbridge, showing her small pointed teeth. "If you have any other queries, we can deal with them at the end of the class." "I've got a query about your course aims," said Hermione. Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrows. "And your name is?" "Hermione Granger," said Hermione. "Well, Miss Granger, I think the course aims are perfectly clear if you read them through carefully," said Professor Umbridge in a voice of determined sweetness. "Well, I don't," said Hermione bluntly. "There's nothing written up there about using defensive spells." There was a short silence in which many members of the class turned their heads to frown at the 3 course aims still written on the blackboard. "Using defensive spells?" Professor Umbridge repeated with a little laugh. "Why, I can't imagine any situation arising in my classroom that would require you to use a defensive spell, Miss Granger. You surely aren't expecting us to be attacked during class?" "We're not going to use magic?" Ron ejaculated loudly. "Students raise their hands when they wish to speak in my class, Mr. Weasley," said Ron, thrusting his hand into the air. Professor Umbridge, smiling still more widely, turned her back on him. Harry and Hermione immediately raised their hands too. Professor Umbridge's pouchy eyes lingered on Harry for a moment before she addressed Hermione. "Yes, Miss Granger? You wanted to ask something else?" "Yes," said Hermione. "Surely the whole point of defense against the dark arts is to practice defensive spells? Are you a ministry-trained educational expert, Miss Granger?" said Hermione in her falsely said Professor Umbridge in her falsely sweet voice. No, but, well, I'm afraid you are not qualified to decide what the whole point of any class is, which is much older and cleverer than you have devised our new program of study. You'll be learning about defensive spells in a secure, risk-free way. What use is that? Said Harry loudly. If we're going to be attacked, it won't be in a hand, Mr. Potter, said Professor Umbridge. Harry thrust his fist into the air. Professor Umbridge promptly turned away from him again, but now several other people had their hands up too. And your name is? Professor Umbridge said to Dean. Dean Thomas. Well, Mr. Thomas? Well, it's like Harry said, isn't it? Said Dean. If we're going to be attacked, it won't be risk-free. I repeat, said Professor Umbridge, smiling in a very irritating fashion at Dean. Do you expect to be attacked during my classes? No, but... Professor Umbridge talked over him. I do not wish to criticize the things that have been run in this school, she said, in an unconvincing smile stretching her wide mouth. But you have been exposed to some very irresponsible wizards in this classroom. Very irresponsible indeed. Not to mention, she gave a nasty little laugh. Extremely dangerous half-breeds. If you mean Professor Lupin, piped up Dean Thomas angrily, he was the best we ever... Mr. Thomas. As I was saying, you have been introduced to spells that have been complex, inappropriate to your age group, and potentially lethal. You have been frightened into believing that you are likely to meet dark attacks every other day. No, we haven't, Hermione said. Your hand is not up, Mrs. Granger. Hermione put up her hand. Professor Umbridge turned away from her. It is my understanding that my predecessor not only performed illegal curses in front of you, he actually performed them on you. Well, he turned out to be a maniac, didn't he? Said Dean Thomas hotly. Mind you, we still learned loads. Your hand is not up, Mr. Thomas, trilled Professor Umbridge. Now it is the view of the ministry that a theoretical knowledge will be more than sufficient to get you through your examination, which, after all, what school is about. And your name is, she added, staring at Parvati, whose hands had just shot up. Parvati Patil. And isn't there a practical bit in our defense against the dark arts OWL? Aren't we supposed to show that we can actually do the counter curses and things? As long as you have studied the theory hard enough, there is no reason why you should not be able to perform the spells under carefully controlled examination conditions, said Professor Umbridge dismissively. Without ever practicing them before? Said Parvati incredulously. Are you telling us that the first time we'll get to do spells will be during our exam? I repeat, as long as you have studied the theory hard enough. And what gut's theory going to be in the real world? Said Harry loudly, his fist in the air again. Professor Umbridge looked up. This is school, Mr. Potter, not the real world, she said softly. So we're not supposed to be prepared for what's waiting out there? There's nothing waiting out there, Mr. Potter. Oh, yeah, said Harry. His temper, which seemed to have been bubbling just beneath the surface all day, was reaching boiling point. Who do you imagine wants to attack children like yourselves? Inquired Professor Umbridge in a horribly honeyed voice. Let's think, said Harry in a mock thoughtful voice. Maybe Lord Voldemort? Ron gasped. Lavender Brown uttered a little scream. The vial slipped sideways off his stole. Professor Umbridge, however, did not flinch. She was staring at Harry with a grimly satisfied expression on her face. 10 points from Gryffindor. Mr. Potter? The classroom was silent and still. Everyone was staring at the side Umbridge or Harry. Now, let me make a few things quite plain. Thank you, everyone. That's all for today. Bye. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to read page 245. Bookmark, close. Peace out.